In a crowded courthouse, the air was thick with the usual hum of whispered conversations, the shuffle of papers, and the sound of gavel hits marking the passage of time within the four sterile walls. Today's docket was no different from any other, yet as the judge looked over the list of cases, he felt an unusual unease. Something about the atmosphere felt off. He dismissed the feeling and continued to prepare himself for the next case, his black robe hanging heavily on his shoulders, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and his gaze sharp as he read the names on the list one by one, his mind shifting between the mundane details of traffic violations and minor offenses that typically filled his daily calendar. The court was full today, with various individuals waiting for their turn under the harsh fluorescent lights, a few in the back, nervously looking at their phones, some hunched over in quiet conversation, while others stared blankly ahead. As the door creaked open, signaling the arrival of the next defendant, the judge glanced up, expecting the usual faces, perhaps a middle-aged man who had forgotten to renew his license, or a young woman caught speeding. Once again, he set his eyes on the woman entering the room, but something was different this time. Her presence disrupted the rhythm of the courtroom. Her calm and confident demeanor stood out in stark contrast to the usual nervousness he saw in defendants. She was tall, with striking features, her posture straight and assured as she walked toward the bench. Her dark skin and the way she carried herself seemed to demand attention. She was dressed simply in a neat yet casual outfit, nothing flashy or eye-catching, but there was something undeniably commanding about her that made the judge pause for a brief moment. When the woman arrived at the front of the room, she stood there silently, waiting for the judge to acknowledge her, without flinching or showing any signs of impatience. Her eyes locked forward, her expression unreadable but calm. It was a stark contrast to the fidgeting defendants he was used to seeing shifting nervously from foot to foot. She seemed completely at ease, as though she belonged here, or perhaps had been in rooms like this many times before. The judge cleared his throat and shifted his attention to the paperwork in front of him. He briefly scanned the case details, a minor traffic violation that had been assigned to his courtroom, another routine case that would be handled quickly, but something in his gut told him that this wouldn't be as simple as the usual speeding ticket or failure to signal before turning. The judge began the proceedings as usual, instructing the woman to confirm her name and the details of the charges against her. The woman spoke softly, but with authority, confirming the information without any sign of distress. He was intrigued by how composed she seemed, as though this moment was inconsequential to her, and yet the judge could not shake the nagging sense that there was more to her than met the eye. He moved through the motions of the case with mechanical precision, reading aloud the charges and explaining the penalty for the offense: a small fine for failing to yield at an intersection, nothing that would raise any alarms. But the woman stood there as still and composed as ever. The judge watched her carefully as he continued speaking, noting how her eyes remained locked forward, and her expression never shifted. It was almost as if she was in a trance or lost in thought. Even though he had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary, he felt his curiosity growing. Something about this woman made him wonder if she was hiding something. But for now he did not voice the question. His role was to simply administer justice as impartially as possible, and so he concluded the case by slapping the fine on her. With the customary formality, his words echoed in the quiet courtroom, but the woman showed no sign of reaction as she nodded slowly and turned to walk away. As the woman began to turn toward the door, her back straight and her movements fluid, the judge could not help but notice the way she carried herself, the grace with which she moved through the room. It wasn't like the hurried shuffle of the usual defendants who left the court with their heads down, or the guilty shuffle of someone trying to avoid the scrutiny of the public gaze. No, this woman moved with a quiet certainty, as though she was moving through a world that she understood far better than anyone else in the room. She didn't rush her steps, nor did she seem eager to leave. There was something about her calm that was almost unsettling, like she had all the time in the world, and no need to be affected by anything around her. The judge found his attention lingering on her as she reached the door, his hand frozen on the papers in front of him, as if something was urging him to ask her a question. But what could it be? Why did this woman stand out so clearly in his mind? There was nothing particularly extraordinary about her, at least not in the way most people would describe extraordinary. She wasn't an obvious celebrity or an infamous public figure, nor did she appear to be someone with wealth or power that demanded immediate attention. But there was something that felt different about her, something in the way she looked at the world, or the way the world seemed to bend around her presence. It was as if she knew something that the rest of them didn't, and in that moment the judge couldn't help but wonder what that knowledge might be. His curiosity got the better of him, and before he realized it, his mouth was speaking, his hand motioning for her to stop. The woman paused mid-step and turned slowly as if she had expected this. At some level her gaze met his eyes, unflinching and steady, and the judge could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She was waiting for him to speak, and it was then that he realized he didn't know exactly what to say. His mind scrambled for the right words to justify why he had asked her to stop. The case was over. There was nothing more to discuss, yet something within him needed to know more. Who was she really? What was behind that serene composure and the quiet self-assurance that seemed to envelop her like a second skin? He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the feeling of awkwardness that had suddenly descended upon him. He needed something to explain why he had summoned her back, something to break the tension that hung between them. Without thinking, he asked the first question that came to mind. "Where are you from?" Her response was slow and deliberate, as though she was choosing her words carefully, but not in a way that seemed evasive. Instead, it was as if she was sharing a piece of herself with the judge, a fragment of a story that didn't quite fit with the case at hand. She paused for a moment, as if weighing the impact of her words before she spoke. "I'm an astronaut," she said matter-of-factly. The words landed in the room like a small explosion, and the judge blinked in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to process what he had just heard. The woman stood there without any sign of nervousness or self-consciousness, her posture as perfect as before. The judge felt the weight of her statement hang in the air, and it seemed impossible to wrap his mind around it. It wasn't that he doubted her, it was more that he couldn't imagine how someone who had flown in space would find themselves in a courtroom over a minor traffic violation. It felt so disconnected, so completely out of place, that for a moment the judge thought he might have misunderstood. Yet there was no mistaking the look in her eyes, the certainty and calm that radiated from her. Everything about her confirmed the truth of her statement. She was indeed an astronaut. The judge's mind raced as the words repeated in his head, like an echo bouncing off the walls of his consciousness. "She's an astronaut," he thought. How could that be possible? She was just standing there in front of him like any other defendant, yet she claimed to have traveled beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Something about it just didn't seem to fit the context of the courtroom. He blinked several times to clear his thoughts and took a deep breath, trying to process this new information. The courtroom was silent now. Every eye in the room was on the woman, waiting for her to elaborate or explain. But she said nothing more. She simply stood there with that calm and steady gaze, as though she had just announced the most normal of facts to a room full of strangers. The judge's hand hovered over the case file as he tried to regain his composure. It was hard to reconcile the woman in front of him with the idea of an astronaut. It felt surreal. He had dealt with so many people over the years in this very room, but none of them had ever told him something so extraordinary. And yet here she was, still so composed, standing in front of him, her presence as grounded as ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. But he wasn't sure what it was. It was as though the world had shifted just slightly, and the familiar rules of the courtroom no longer applied. He decided to break the silence, asking her more about her background and her time in space. Perhaps it was his way of making sense of the situation, or maybe it was just his natural curiosity driving him to learn more. But whatever the reason, he found himself drawn to the idea of this woman and her story. There was no denying the intrigue it stirred within him. The woman smiled softly and took a slow step forward before answering. Her voice was steady and unhurried as she spoke about her time as an astronaut, how she had trained for years and been part of a groundbreaking mission into space. The details were fascinating and surreal to the judge as she described the process of launching into orbit, the feeling of weightlessness, and the breathtaking view of Earth from space. She spoke with such ease and confidence, as though these were stories she had shared countless times before, but to the judge it felt like he was hearing them for the first time, and he was captivated by each word she said. She mentioned her crew and the intense training they had gone through to prepare for the mission, the way they worked together in the isolation of space to solve problems, and navigate challenges that most people could never imagine. The judge found himself hanging on her every word, his mind racing with questions, yet he remained silent, allowing her to speak. As she recounted her experiences, the sense of awe in her voice was unmistakable as she spoke about the beauty of the earth, seen from space, the vastness of the universe, and the fragile nature of life on their home planet. She spoke of moments of introspection and the realization of how small and interconnected everything truly was. It was a perspective that most people could never understand, and as she spoke, the judge couldn't help but feel a sense of humility wash over him. Here he was sitting in a courtroom surrounded by the trivialities of everyday life, and yet this woman had experienced something far beyond the ordinary, far beyond what he had ever known or could ever imagine. For a moment, he felt completely insignificant in the face of her extraordinary experiences. He had been so focused on the mundane tasks of his job, the small details of his daily work, that he hadn't stopped to consider the bigger picture, the vastness of the world beyond the courtroom, and all the wonders it held. In that moment, the judge realized how easily he had slipped into a routine of judgment and procedure without ever considering the depth of the lives that passed through his courtroom. He wondered how many other incredible people had walked in and out of these doors without anyone ever knowing the greatness they carried within them. As the woman continued to share her story, the judge listened intently. Every word she spoke seemed to pull him deeper into a world that felt both distant and intimate at the same time. The tales she told were of vastness and silence, of floating among the stars. Yet there was something profoundly personal in the way she described her experiences, something that made her seem more human than ever, despite the fact that her life had been one that few could ever imagine, much less live. The room remained quiet save for the sound of her voice and the occasional shuffle of papers on the judge's desk. Her words seemed to have the power to suspend time itself, as though the mundane world of courtroom proceedings had faded into nothingness, leaving only the two of them standing in the presence of something far more significant. He found himself momentarily lost in her narrative, drawn into her descriptions of space, so vividly detailed he could almost picture the expanse of stars and the curvature of the earth from a distance. It was hard to believe that just moments ago she had been standing there as any other defendant caught up in a minor traffic violation. The incongruity of it all struck him again. How could someone who had seen the vast reaches of space be subject to the same rules and fines as someone who had simply forgotten to signal before turning? It didn't seem to fit, it didn't make sense. But there was something beautiful in that realization, too, something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the world and the people who lived in it. The woman paused for a moment, catching the judge off guard as he realized he had been hanging on her every word, his mind racing to keep up with the images she was painting for him. But now it was as though he had been brought back to the present reality of the courtroom, and the gravity of the situation hit him once more. She was standing there as an astronaut, as a woman who had seen the world from a perspective few would ever understand. And yet here she was in this room in front of him, dealing with the very human and everyday consequence of a simple mistake, a mistake that everyone made. And yet here it was as if the universe itself had paused for a brief moment to draw his attention to this one extraordinary life standing before him. It was hard to reconcile the two realities, the vastness of space and the narrow confines of the courtroom. And yet that was the very truth she carried with her. She was both extraordinary and ordinary, all at once, in her calm demeanor and the way she spoke so matter-of-factly about the things that most people would find unbelievable. There was an undeniable elegance. She had already reconciled these two worlds long before the judge had even considered their existence in the same space. She had accepted both the incredible and the mundane as part of her story, and now she stood before him as a reminder that everyone had a story worth hearing. He thought about his role in the courtroom, the people who came through his doors every day, and the stories they carried with them. How often had he overlooked their depths? How often had he simply followed the motions of the law without truly seeing the individuals in front of him? How many other lives had passed through here unnoticed? How many had been brushed aside or reduced to mere cases in his docket? It made him uncomfortable to think about. He had always prided himself on being fair, on doing his job with the precision and impartiality it required. But now that certainty wavered as he realized that in focusing so intently on the rules he had failed to see the richness of the lives that lay behind the cases he had judged. And here was this woman, this astronaut, standing before him as a living testament to the fact that there was more to every person than met the eye. Her presence was a reminder that the world was full of untold stories waiting to be acknowledged, if only someone would take the time to listen. The judge stood there silent for a moment, his thoughts swirling around in a haze as he absorbed the weight of her story. It felt as though the entire courtroom had shifted, and he had been thrust into a reality where everything he knew had been turned upside down. The woman's calm had a strange effect on him. She didn't speak with arrogance or pride, but with the simple truth of her experiences, as though she had long ago come to terms with the incredible life she led. And yet there was no trace of pretension in her demeanor. She was just telling the truth as it was, her words, not seeking validation, not expecting awe, but simply sharing what had been her reality for so many years. And the more the judge listened, the more he realized how much he had been missing in the world, how much he had overlooked in his day-to-day existence. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about understanding the people who passed through his courtrooms. It was about acknowledging their humanity, the vastness of their experiences, the truth of their lives that he had so often ignored. He glanced at the case file again. But this time it seemed irrelevant. The fine, the violation, the legal jargon, it all felt so small in comparison to the story unfolding before him. How could a simple traffic violation be so significant in the face of the woman's life, in the face of her journey into space? How many people in the courtroom that day had ever been anywhere near as extraordinary? How many had experienced something so life-changing, so monumental? And here she was dealing with the consequences of something so mundane and ordinary. The judge shook his head, as if trying to clear his thoughts. But the more he thought about it, the more it became clear that there was no easy way to reconcile these two worlds, the one she had lived and the one he governed. And yet she seemed to navigate them both with a grace that he could barely comprehend. She had been to the stars and back, but she stood before him now in this very room, no different from any other person, no different from anyone else who had come to face the judgment of the law. And that fact both humbled and bewildered him. She was human, just like everyone else, but she had done something that most people would never even dare to dream of. And yet here she was facing a consequence for something that was so fundamentally human, so grounded in the everyday struggles that connected them all. He suddenly felt an intense need to know more, not just about her career as an astronaut, but about who she was as a person, her thoughts, her philosophies, her worldview, what had shaped her into the person standing before him today. And so, without thinking, he asked her a question that had been on his mind since the moment she had told him she was an astronaut. "Tell me what it was like up there," he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She looked at him and smiled gently, as if she had expected the question. She took a deep breath and began to speak once again. But this time her words were different. They were more reflective, more personal, as if she were sharing a piece of her soul, something that went beyond the cold facts and the technical details of space travel. She told him about the stillness of space, how it was so silent and vast that it made her feel small and insignificant, and yet at the same time it made her appreciate the beauty of life on Earth more than she ever had before. She spoke of the fragility of their planet, how they were all so interconnected, so dependent on each other, and yet how easily the world could change in the blink of an eye. She spoke about moments of introspection and clarity that she had experienced while floating in zero gravity. As she looked out at the Earth below her, the sense of awe and wonder that had gripped her heart in those moments, she spoke with such reverence for the world they lived in that the judge found himself silently moved by her words. It was a perspective he had never considered before, and yet it made everything seem so much clearer, so much more precious. It wasn't just about following the rules or carrying out the law. It was about understanding the bigger picture, seeing beyond the surface, and truly acknowledging the people who crossed his path every day, each one of them carrying a world of experiences he could never fully comprehend. And for the first time in his career, the judge realized that maybe his role was not just about enforcing the law, but about seeing the humanity in each person who stood before him. As the woman finished speaking, the judge sat back in his chair, a sense of awe and humility sweeping over him. The words she had shared were not just stories of space. They were reflections on life itself, the way she spoke about Earth, its fragility, and the interconnectedness of all things made him feel as though he had been looking at the world through a narrow lens for far too long. He had spent so many years focused on the rules and procedures of the law that he had neglected to see the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface. The woman before him had spent her life looking at the world from a place that very few people could ever reach yet. She spoke of it with a sense of calm that seemed to transcend the physical distances she had traveled. She had seen the planet from above, and yet her feet were still firmly grounded in the reality of everyday life. She was not detached from the world she had spent years exploring, but instead had learned to appreciate it in a way that most people could never understand. The judge felt as though he had been given a glimpse into a world that was far greater than anything he had ever known or even imagined. As he listened to her, he began to question the role he had been playing in his own life. Had he been so focused on the mundane that he had missed out on the truly extraordinary moments that had been unfolding around him every day? He glanced at her once more, taking in the calm determination in her eyes and the quiet strength she carried with her. It was as though she had already reconciled all of the contradictions that existed in her life, the vastness of space and the smallness of human existence, the greatness of her accomplishments, and the simplicity of her presence in the courtroom. She had seen things that most people could never comprehend, and yet she stood before him as humble and grounded as anyone he had ever encountered. And it was in that moment that the judge realized something important. He had been so quick to issue his fine and move on to the next case that he hadn't even considered the complexity of the person standing before him. He had been so focused on the letter of the law that he had failed to see the story behind the violation, the story of a woman who had left the confines of Earth's atmosphere and come back with a perspective that most could never fathom. Yet here she was in front of him, like everyone else, subjected to the same rules and regulations that governed their lives. It felt almost absurd to the judge. How could someone who had done something so remarkable be treated as just another person caught in the web of bureaucracy? He could feel the weight of his earlier decision pressing on him. The fine he had issued seemed so insignificant now, compared to the depth of her experiences, and yet he had treated her just like any other defendant in his courtroom without giving her the respect and recognition she truly deserved. He found himself suddenly overcome with the desire to correct his mistake, to acknowledge the incredible life she had lived and the sacrifices she had made to get to this point. But how could he do that? How could he take back a decision that had already been made? The woman stood there waiting patiently, as if she knew exactly what the judge was thinking, as if she had seen this play out in her mind before, and was simply waiting for him to come to the realization on his own. She did not seem upset or angry that she had been fined for such a small infraction. In fact, she appeared to have already moved past it entirely, and yet the judge couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change, something had to be done to right the wrong he had unintentionally committed. He could feel the tension in his chest, the desire to make things right. But he didn't know how to begin. The case had been closed, the fine had been issued, the paperwork had been filed, but in the face of her extraordinary life, he could not help but feel that there was something more important that needed to happen, something that transcended the law and the routine of his daily work. The judge sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of guilt and realization that he had treated this woman like anyone else when she was so clearly not like anyone else. She had lived a life of unimaginable experiences, and yet he had reduced her to a simple case to be processed and dismissed like so many others he had dealt with over the years. And now he was confronted with the question of how to make amends, how to correct the mistake he felt he had made. How could he simply let her walk out of the courtroom without acknowledging the magnitude of her life, without recognizing her achievements? It was a question that seemed to hang in the air between them. He felt as though he had to do something, but what was there to do? The fine had been issued, and the legal process had been followed. There was no way to reverse it, and yet something deep within him told him that this wasn't enough, that the paperwork and the cold efficiency of the courtroom couldn't be the final word on this woman's life, on what she had contributed to the world. The silence in the room stretched on, and the judge could feel the tension building within him. He turned his gaze to her once more, and for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, he truly saw her. He saw the calm strength in her eyes, the quiet confidence with which she carried herself, and he realized that her presence here was not an accident, that she had come into his life for a reason, that the universe had somehow brought her to this moment, so that he could learn something profound about the human condition, about the way people move through the world, and about the importance of recognizing the extraordinary in the everyday. He knew then that he couldn't just let her leave without doing something to make it right. He had to do something to honor her story, to honor who she was, and what she had achieved. He had to give her the respect and recognition she deserved. He stood up slowly, his mind made up, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked toward her for the first time, he was not focused on the legalities or the procedures that governed a courtroom. He was focused on the person standing before him, the person who had lived a life that most could only dream of, and yet here she was in front of him, humbly standing, as if her experiences were nothing more than a part of the larger story of the human race, as if she had no need for special treatment, no need for admiration. And yet he knew that she deserved both. He reached her, and without a word handed her the fine papers he had originally slapped on her desk, with a clear intention to make a correction, something he had never done before in the course of his career. This act felt different. This wasn't about simply canceling a fine, it was about making a statement. It was about acknowledging that in a world filled with rules and regulations, there was always room for humanity to shine through. He saw a flicker of surprise cross her face as she took the papers from his hand. But she didn't say anything. She simply looked at him for a moment, as though she understood the deeper meaning behind the gesture. There was no need for words between them. She didn't need him to explain. She didn't need him to say that he was sorry for his mistake. She understood without a word the weight of the moment, the acknowledgement of her story, her life, her impact on the world. In that one quiet exchange, the judge realized that sometimes the most meaningful actions were the ones that spoke without words, the ones that transcended legalities and formalities, and spoke to the heart of what it meant to be human. As the woman looked at the judge, she seemed to understand the silent apology that had passed between them. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate speeches, just a simple acknowledgement of the truth that had been unfolding between them since she first entered the courtroom. It was as if in that moment everything had shifted, and what had once seemed like a minor infraction, a simple traffic violation, had grown into something much more significant, something that went beyond the law and into the heart of who they both were. The judge felt a sense of relief wash over him. A weight he hadn't even realized he had been carrying seemed to lift, and yet it was paired with a deep sense of gratitude for the experience that had unfolded before him today. He had never expected this case to become something so transformative. He had never anticipated that a routine violation would lead him to question his own role in the world, his own understanding of justice and humanity. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on being fair, but now he saw that there was more to fairness than just following the rules. There was a deeper level of understanding, a level that required empathy and recognition of the unique lives that people led. The woman before him had given him that gift. She had opened his eyes to the complexities of life and the way that each person carried their own story, their own journey with them. He looked at her one last time before she turned to leave, and in that glance he saw something that he had never seen before. It wasn't just the astronaut in front of him. It was the woman, the person who had lived a life that demanded respect, not because of the title or the achievements, but because of the depth of her experiences and the way she carried herself with such quiet dignity. It wasn't the stars or the space missions that had made her extraordinary. It was her humanity, her ability to see the world and everyone in it with a perspective that few could ever hope to understand. And as she turned and walked out of the courtroom, the judge couldn't help but feel a sense of awe that he had been lucky enough to witness such a profound moment in the course of his career. He had spent so many years dealing with the routine, the ordinary, the mundane, but today he had been reminded that life was so much bigger than the confines of his courtroom and the narrow lens through which he had been looking. He had seen a glimpse of the extraordinary, and he would never forget it. For the first time in his career, he felt a deep sense of purpose that went beyond the law, beyond the case files and the paperwork. It was a sense of connection to the people who came through his doors, to their stories and their lives, and he knew that from this day forward, He would never view his role the same way again as the courtroom doors closed behind her. He felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the lesson she had taught him without ever intending to do so. It was a lesson about the human spirit, about the complexity of life, and the importance of seeing each person for who they truly were, not just who they appeared to be on paper or in a courtroom. It was a lesson about empathy and understanding. And most of all, it was a reminder that every life, no matter how ordinary it may seem on the surface, was worth acknowledging and honoring in a way that went beyond the law, beyond the fine, and the judgment. It was a reminder that we were all just human trying to make our way in a vast and sometimes overwhelming world, and that no one should ever be reduced to a mere case or a statistic.